what we're going to be talking about is this man, Romano Guardini, who has an Italian name, but was probably the most important German theologian in the 20th century. That is a Catholic theologian. The last four popes, everyone since he passed away, has cited him as a principal influence. And the work that we will be looking at is one that has never been translated into English before. And it was the topic chosen for Pope Francis's abandoned dissertation in the 1980s. So the topic at hand has very little to do with religion per se. But I'll just say what Pope Francis's title for his dissertation was going to be. It was going to be Polar Tension as the Structure of Daily Thought and of Christian Proclamation. So he's saying that, what is this question of polar tension? That is exactly what we're going to be talking about. What Romano Guardini meant by that. Writing in 1912 in Germany, right before the breakout of the First World War, at the dawn of incredible scientific discoveries. Guardini was born in 1885, so he was born in a world that had electric lighting, for instance. That was pretty new. So he sought out from the very beginning to say, in a world dominated by rational scientific thinking, including psychology at this point, how do we vouch for what is actually alive, what mathematics can't account for? And can we do it conceptually? Is there any way that we can make a conceptual framework that can account for everything that mathematics sort of leaves behind? And at the time, he begins by making the distinction between humanity and machines, even as early as 1920. He's doing this, and I believe it takes on a special significance in our time, where we're surrounded by things that appear human, but aren't. And it begs the question, what makes something that's alive actually living? Is there some sort of structural principle that we can speak about? Years ago, there was the controversy between Ray Kurzweil and the writer Douglas Rushkoff, where Kurzweil proposed in an evolutionary sense that humans are being outmoded by something else. And Douglas said, well, maybe then I'm on team human, right? So the question is there something ineffable? Can we really not put it into words? Or can we put it into words? But it's worth saying that when Guardini was writing this in 1912, that the word soul had really lost a lot of its force and meaning. It was an academic word divorced of it, or a religious word divorced of its real vital sense. That a bug has a soul, or a plant has a soul. And so we're going to be looking at that.
Wonderful.
Highly important thinker. Yeah.
Excellent. So I just want to say, I know very little about Romano Guardini, but from whatever I have gleaned, seems like he is probably the most influential religious thinker in the 20th century. That's what it appears from everything I've read. He's done something very remarkable, which is very hard to do. He has actually taken the core of Christianity and tried to integrate it, try to take what was going on in his time and look at what is going on in this time. There is First World War, okay? There is Marxism, the entire Russian Revolution. Then comes the Second World War, okay? There is tremendous amount of uncertainty. And he's trying to provide answers which would be accessible to anybody. whether you're secular or Catholic or from any other religion, for any human being, he's trying to make that accessible. And the influence can be seen by the fact that the last four popes, credit him for many, many things. Of course, the culmination is the current Pope Francis starting a PhD on his work. The Pope before that is his student. And the other two popes before that also, since the death of Guardini, have given him credit. So he's a very deep thinker. And it's, what we try to do in this 52 Living Ideas is that we try to connect things together. And what he has done is that he has done an integration. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So Peter, welcome. This is delightful to be able to talk to you about this.
Thank you, Shrikant. And I want to add something to what you just said, which is the influence that he's had is exactly as you say. It's enormous, but it's almost invisible. For as deep as that influence is, almost nobody talks about it, at least in English. And if they do talk about Guardini, they talk about him strictly in a religious sense. That is, he had plenty to write about the liturgy, specifically the Catholic Mass, and how to pray the rosary and things like this. But the thing that Francis in particular has zeroed in on is this basic human thing that almost nobody else has spoken about. And if you write Guardini into YouTube, I am quite certain this will be the only example of anyone discussing this work so far. And that is just a disclaimer to say any mistakes I make, we'll just say I'm trying to plow ahead, and we'll see who can clean up sort of behind.
Wonderful. All right, so let's get started. So who was Romano Guardini? How did he start? Let's start at the beginning.
Sure. So Romano Guardini was Italian born. He was born in Verona to a very, very wealthy family. Brothers who wound up being successful in one way or another. But the family moved to Mainz, Germany when he was 1 year old. And he was going on a track to become some kind of lawyer or economist or whatever. And he and his friend, who was also in that same track, they sort of had a joint mental breakdown in the German academic system, particularly when they came upon Immanuel Kant and the metaphysics of all that. And through discussion, just in a summer in an attic, right before this thing happens, they both decide to throw away that academic life, and they both become priests. They sign up for a monastery, and they get ordained as priests in a strange time in Germany, right when there was this whole worry about modernism. All these new media of radio and telegraph and stuff. The church had really taken a beating in Europe, particularly after the French Revolution, where the political powers, were sort of unfettered and could make the church do more or less whatever they wanted. And so the church felt at this time that they had to make bold claims. So, by the time Guardini is born, the church has for the first time claimed papal infallibility at the First Vatican Council. And then in 1910, they published this thing called the Oath Against Modernism, that any seminarian is required to say that this is doctrine, this is what we believe, and we don't accept modern theories. Effectively, this leaves them out of every interesting conversation at the time. So they don't get to discuss Freud. They don't get to discuss Carl Jung. They don't get to discuss experimental psychology or anything like that. But Guardini and his friend Paul Neuendorfer.
Let me just interrupt here.
Oh,
so both
sure,
those things, the doctrine of infallibility and this statement against modernism, seems to be completely opposite to the direction of thinking that I see in Guardini. Is that true?
Yes. And in fact, Guardini's ordination as a priest was deferred for 2 years or maybe 1 year, because he was quote unquote suspected of modernism, according to a biography.
Mhm.
Which is to say, there was a very organized effort to, since 1879, Pope Leo XIII, the first action he did as Pope was to say, we need to restore St. Thomas Aquinas to his seat in science. That is, we need to be able to participate in these discussions. And by the time Guardini's a student and wants to pursue his faith in this academic way, there were very strict rules for how you were going to speak about these things, whether it's psychology or Catholic dogma. All these things were laid out in manuals and very rigid. There are certain people you can mention, certain people you could not mention, certain ways that you had to mention the things that you were talking about. And so what Guardini realized from an early moment is, as I explained in the preface, that the vitality from a lot of these terms had sort of lost their impact on an audience. That is, you could recite the dogma that man has a rational soul, but what does that mean when all around you, you just see chaos, bloodshed, and technology that nobody can explain that seems to be dominating everything? And so, like, how does that explain cinema? How does that explain advertising? How does that explain mass production or war? And so Guardini writes this thing birthed out of conversation with his friend, this man that he decides to become a priest with at the same time, Karl Neuendorfer. And it's not a formal academic writing at all. It's just something he, in fact, squeezes out in 1914, right before the war starts, in order to say, I just want to get this out there, even in this like 10-page format, to talk about what I think is a way that we can vouch for all the stuff that rational mathematical science leaves behind. That is still real. And he dares to sort of confront it in a conceptual way, all this non-conceptual stuff, right? So that comes out in 1914. 10 years later, that original 10-pager, which, by the way, gets sent in a letter to Martin Heidegger, who was his junior student at the University of Freiburg. He asks his opinion on it. So 10 years later, that blossoms into 300 pages of a really thought out thing that never loses steam over the course of his life. People keep wanting him to republish it. And he even, before his death in 68, he published 2 epilogues that say, in case of death, this is what I was talking about and why I did it. And here's it all boiled down into 5 points. So Guardini really wanted to make sure that this made it out there, and interest never died for it. So much so that Pope Paul VI wanted to make Guardini a cardinal in the 60s when he was too sick to do anything, and said that this was the way that he wanted to govern. That is not to rule, but he wanted to play with this notion of oppositions. And we'll get to what that means.
Sure. Let me interrupt just for a second,
yeah.
because I want to talk briefly about the historical context of First World War and how big that was. Okay, most people don't fully grasp it, but the First World War, actually much more, far more than the Second World War, was a radical event in Western Europe. Before that, things were progressing at a tremendous rate. Everything, and people were taking progress for granted, that everything will be positive. The horrendous bloodshed and the effects of this First World War shook people up at a very deep level about what human beings were. It's very difficult to imagine the gravity of that. The only thing, like in America, that we could say is maybe Civil War matches that kind of, as compared to anything else in American history. But First World War was that event for the whole world. And to be able to come and reassert the value of human beings in that context is a huge, huge achievement, because everything was shaken up to the core for common man. So that's the context in which he's doing the core of his work. Go ahead, Peter.
That's exactly right. And, I think Shrikant, let me know what you think about this, but I think at this point, it makes sense to dive in to the opening text of this this book on the philosophy of the living concrete.
Let's do it.
So I'm going to read the first 4 paragraphs of it, because this is under the heading, the question. And the question is, the living concrete, like the living reality, and whether it can be grasped with knowledge. And so he begins by saying, and here I'm quoting, if we look at ourselves, I should say, sorry, this is my translation from the German. I don't speak German or read it, but with Google Translate and with proofreading from others who do, I've made this. So I welcome anyone who speaks German to reach out to me, peterberkman@gmail.com. Thank you very much. So here we go. This is my crude translation, which I think works. If we look at ourselves, in ourselves, we find bodily form, limbs and organs, psychic structures and orders. We find processes of an external or internal kind, drives, acts, changes of state. What is there and what happens we see as a unity. It doesn't just appear to us as such, it is. We would have to distrust any perception if we wanted to doubt that we really are a body-soul unity. It is us, and we cannot help but relate to this unity everything that becomes individual. What happens to us and through us as a glue that supports it or as an effect that emanates from it. This unity does not lie in a single order of relationships like that of a machine. In this, the parts are only mechanically next to, behind, or on top of each other. But here, inside of me, I can't help but look at depth to the next, behind and above one another. Here I find an outside and an inside. That is already clear in how anatomical internal organs or parts relate to external ones, but then also in the facts of sensation and movement, and how the processes of awareness relate to physical ones, or how inner psychic happenings relate to more superficial ones. It's a relationship that I can only do justice to by seeing an inside as related to an outside sold into an inside to a final depth, and something inside goes outside up to a final limit. I do not find this relationship with the machine, in which all parts are simply next to, behind, or on top of another. The unity of the living also contains this machine order, but it is not exhausted therein. It is not just made up of parts, but also has the direction of depth. And indeed, the most fleeting observation shows how the living whole takes in from the outside in. It nourishes me with substances and forces and builds up from the inside out. It grows. And this is halfway. There's 2 more bits. This unity is built out. Moreover, the next observation shows that it is built out according to a plan, not in such a way that all sorts of substances accidentally lay together or external forces and influences intersect with one another, although this also happens, but essentially, it is a matter of an orderly process dominated by a building plan, by an internally present and effective figure. Everything separated is closed to form a unity. The whole thing built from within and on the basis of an orderly plan. I find even more in myself. I experience myself not only as a point of passage for continuous processes, but also and above all as an origin. In me, this in shimmers ambiguously. Let's take it that way for the time being. Drives arise. Acts begin within me. I stand statically in myself as a closed structure, but also dynamically as an independent active unit. much more can be said about this fact that I do not experience myself as a fragment of existence, but as a whole built from within, not as a self-evident happening, but as a closed development, not a random flood of properties, but as an inherent figure. But all this means I experience myself as concrete. And this concrete stands in itself from outside to inside, from inside to outside, builds itself up and works from its own source. Simply, it is alive. So much may be enough for the question that concerns us here. Can this concrete living thing be grasped in a cognitive manner? So that is the question that he sets out. So that's the full quote of the opening to this.
Wow.
And so I have brief commentary on that.
Please do.
Which so as he continues, he's ultimately talking about two kinds of knowledge in that human being that were sort of rampant at that time. On one hand, the mathematical proof, this highly rationalized scientific form of knowledge, and then this other form of knowledge, which is called perhaps intuitive or feeling. Guardini doesn't like these words, though. He says something has to be drawn out to actually fully account for that experience and to vouch for it as something that is ultimately real and not just woo, not ineffable. So since mathematical proof can describe dead things just as well as it can describe live things, he wanted to split that difference and make that case. So in that intuitive view, in Germany at the time, that was sometimes seen as the romantic view or even the symbolist view, right? But Guardini, and this is where it all begins. This is the seed from which everything in this work on oppositions grows. As he says, what if these two modes of knowledge are not contradictions? What if they aren't enemies? What if those two modes of knowledge rather, in fact, presuppose or even demand each other for any knowledge to exist at all? And so then further, he says, can there be a conceptual framework that addresses that reality of that living concrete? And if there could be such a thing, that structure would have to be one of living tensions and balances between these things. And that is, it isn't one or the other, and it's not a compromise between them either. He talks about how rather it is that tension itself, the existence of this sort of nameless tension, at least nameless in this case, that is the living root of both of them. So the pure intuition doesn't exist, and the purely scientific doesn't exist, and you can't do both at the same time. But the ebb and flow of both of these things is precisely life itself. And so again, we're talking about how it was difficult to speak about a soul, but he's managed to do all of this without quoting Aristotle. So he had to be very rigorous and precise about these relationships and their structure, because ultimately he knew Aristotle quite well, and he knew Plato quite well, and he knew Bonaventure and Aquinas quite well. So he's ultimately, as I would put it, recasting this stuff. And the final thing I'll say in terms of this introduction is that all of that I've just described, not this, not that, and not in the middle, that living root he calls opposition or polar tension. And that's what I want to talk about next. So
wonderful.
Yes.
So let me.
So that's the opening. Yeah.
Excellent. Peter, this is going to be amazing. This is very deep. This is really the core of kind of epistemology, of philosophy, metaphysics. It's all right here. So let me try to put it in multiple ways, and tell me whether how it relates to it. So one issue is that of whole and the parts. He's saying there are parts, but there is a whole. You can't just look at the whole. You need to look at the parts too. but you can't look at the parts themselves and forget the whole. So that there is part and whole. There is also inside and outside. There is inside of you and you're doing things outside. Both are operative at the same time. You can't just look at inside without looking at the outside. You actually can't understand the inside that way. You can't just look at the outside of what you're doing with your action without understanding the inside. You can't understand the outside that way. You need both of those things. There is things at the scientific level. You're in science, you always have to name things. You need to make things precise. So this is like, Lao Tzu talks about it, naming things. Naming is necessary in order to figure things out. But you can't, when you're naming something, you can't forget what it is, the metaphysical object that you're trying to name, and replace it with names. Then you have lost the entire contact with reality. But you can't just say, I'm going to hold on to reality without the names, because then you won't be able to do anything with reality. So you need metaphysics and you need epistemology. You need the inside and the outside. You need the whole and the part. That's how I understand it. Is that a fair way of understanding what he's saying?
Absolutely. And the way that you describe the whole and the part, each of those things, these are contrasts, which is a way that the title Oppositions has also been translated. So knowing something through something else. Yes, that's exactly what is going on here. You phrased it perfectly. And I think now it's a good time to go into what exactly does he mean by contrast? Because he winds up building a system of them. He describes 8 different contrasts, oppositions that exist that we can talk about. And one of them, in fact, is the part and the whole. But there's a section where he says, what he actually goes as far to say, what does the word opposition mean? And he starts by saying, let's consider the existence of what we can experience. Structures, forms, but he says, we do not perceive color, but colored things. More precisely, this leaf, that particular green color, not taste forms, but this fruit with this very specific sweet aroma, that taste. And so the question then becomes, in what way is this something else? So this is the knowing something through something else. How can I relate this? Which is to say, this is about the time that Einstein's relativity, or like the notion of relativity in general, is gaining steam at this moment. And so in a way, that's what he's talking about. He's an example that he gives is, I can say my fingertips are round, but in what way are they round? Because if you zoom in, you actually see little ridges, right? and they actually can get quite sharp. But he says, but no one can deny that, I perceive this as round. So the way that I perceive my fingertip as round is that when I pluck the guitar string with it, I get a dull sound. And when I pluck it with the nail, I get a sharp sound. And in fact, the less round the nail is filed, the sharper the sound you get. So he uses another example of singing a note, that a unified impulse sustains it, the coherent movement of the lungs, constant exertion of the throat muscles and vocal cords. But in addition to the ongoing persistent tone, there's also structures, static structures. That constant process of breathing is structured by a drawing in and expelling of air so sharply that you can interrupt it whenever you want. That is, you can have rests, And the movement of all those vocal cords are divided into vibrations. And these things have rhythm, right? So, so talking about oppositions in themselves, can get easy to lose it. So he moves very quickly into outlining them. So he starts with that first thing that we sort of just touched upon, which is action and sort of rest. but before we go through them, I'll just say 3 of them have to do specifically with this inner human process. 3 more have to do with that inner human specifically relating to the outside world. So those first ones that are human, he calls intra-empirical. Those ones that relate to the human and the outside world, he calls trans-empirical. And then he has 2 oppositions which deal with the structure of the oppositions themselves. And that sounds very strange, but maybe this is for another time. But I want to reiterate that he mentions these sort of death zones over and over again. And it's the middle in those 2 poles. Basically, when dialogue between them stops, or when you have that pure version where it suddenly is not listening to the other pole, this means ultimately death, because they flip on an axis. And so again, they're renewed from that living root, as he puts it. And so many of these 8 oppositions, he doesn't give a name to them. He just says the pole on which they operate. So in a word, you have dynamic and static, you have part and whole, you have limit and the swelling of that limit. You have production and then disposition, so sort of creativity and order. You have rule and originality. You have immanence and transcendence. And then you have affinity and differentiation. And then ultimately connectedness and discreteness. So all of these, he does not assign a name to any of these tensions. But when you read them and you have a background in Aristotle, you start to notice that he's naming things that he's not naming things that Aristotle, in fact, gave names to. Terms like entelechy, or maybe even hylomorphic. These are things that appear in Aristotle. And before we move on, I want to say that oppositions sort of has a Greek antecedent in Aristotle. The word that Aristotle uses for it is enantiological, that is set against one another. Perhaps the most important thing about the structure of all 8 of these tensions that Guardini describes is that they are not, they do not erase each other. And that is, he puts the word opposition as being totally distinct from this other sort of pairing, which he calls Widerspruch, or contradiction. So this tension is not yes and no. It is not good and evil. It is not being and non-being. And that, I think, is perhaps the most important part of what these oppositions are, how they operate. And we can get a bit into that later as we talk about his epilogue for all this stuff that he writes in the 60s. But yeah, that's enough to be said, I think, in broad scope for the structure of how he outlines these 8 different oppositions. 3 about the human, 3 about the human in the world, and then 2 about the oppositions themselves. So it might be good to have this somewhere.
Yeah, can you go ahead and just recap? So what are the 3 for humans?
So in the intra-empirical opposites, the one for humans, you have dynamic and static, which I call what persists despite undergoing change. Aristotle called that entelechy. Limit and swelling of that limit. And so that's shape and what eludes being shaped. Totality and detail, which we call part and whole, maybe. And that's the gestalt, the figure and the ground. The sort of, McLuhan called it the tradition and the individual talent, quoting Eliot. So then you have the human in the world. And that is where you get things like creative production and then the ordering of that creative production. So production and disposition, nothing can be disposed unless it's produced first. So that's sort of the way that an artist relates to an audience. Then you have rule and originality, or chaos, or ursprünglich, I think ursprünglich he calls. And that's what McLuhan, I think, called making and matching. And finally, as the human relates to the world, you have immanence and transcendence. So we might call this simply percepts and concepts, or pattern recognition. So when you notice a pattern in the world and you start to see it somewhere else, and there must be something that exists somewhere that is that. So that's enough for the human in the world. But then as for the oppositions themselves, they're structured in this such way, where there's similarity and differentiation. So they're similar because you can group them in the same thing, but they're different because they exist on a pole. And so it has to do with, in this way, they are similar. In this way, they are different. So Aquinas might have called this the analogy of proper proportionality, that there is a mode for each of these measurements. And then finally, you have to the oppositions themselves and the transcendental oppositions, the second one, which is connectedness and discreteness. And this I would call, but still one. That is what Aquinas would call the unity of being itself.
Wow, this is fantastic. So let me try to put it. What I try to do is that I'm trying to connect this idea of oppositions with what other things people might know. So, I mean, the most prominent example of thinking this way that I know of is the Yin Yang and it is, in the Chinese, we're studying Tao Te Ching. It's presented exactly the same way. It is the yielding versus the more forceful, all of them, perceptual, conceptual, it's all, formulated the same way. And the core thing is that you always hold that you need both of them. And while you're doing one of them, it has the element of the other in them. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And when you switch to the other one, it has the element of the first one in it. And you need kind of this play, the dynamic play between those two for the whole to function. So is that view similar to Guardini's view?
Yeah, I think it is. The thing that it does not have in it, so that it does describe the oppositions, but what it does not describe is the difference that Guardini makes, a stark distinction between oppositions, of which is a structural principle for all of reality, and what he calls Widerspruch, or contradiction, that yes and no, that being and non-being, it being the case and it not being the case, or simply light and darkness. This has a lot to do with the sort of Augustinian notion of the evil being a privation of existence, being a reduction of being itself. I
think, this is a great observation, because the way I see it is that, like, I see the Chinese thought. I don't know much about the Chinese thought, but I see it as being kind of, how shall I say, very metaphorical. So in a single image, they will try to capture these relationships, whereas the Western tradition is far more developed in logos. So it will make very fine distinctions. So for example, he's making 8 fine distinctions about the same pattern that is tried to be captured with a diagram here in the Chinese context. But it's kind of, and it's the difference between the alphabetic way and the entire kind of logos tradition of the West.
Right. And starkly so that he goes even meta to have oppositions about the oppositions themselves.
Yes.
That's the weirdest part, I think.
Yes. Excellent. Wonderful. Let's move ahead.
So I want to move to the end of that original work. This is a huge overview. I'm skipping over a lot of stuff, but near the end, he talks about why this is important for humans at this time. So he's talking about the objective human world, the concept of the objective human world that would be a reduction of the world itself, right? And talks about how does a human being relate to their individual environment? Because ultimately, this rises out from why do humans behave the way that they do? This is a sort of psychological premise here. So he writes, the individual stands in a topsoil. They see certain aspects very strongly, others more weakly, and still others not at all. The same applies to the ability to experience and act. And experience shows that in the course of an individual's development, it tends to become more and more one-sided, even just from an energy-saving principle, since the more strongly trained faculties are easier to use. They're what we fall back on. And he says, for our question, that means the following. Nothing is more fictitious than the assumption that our seeing and thinking are unprejudiced, or the requirement that it should be so. Only human beings at all could be without prejudice. And only, again, with regard to the objective human world, which also does not exist. And he goes on to say, in any case, this dependency, these biases are infinitely tenacious, and the stronger and more escapable they are, the more naively the claim of non-prejudice is made. And he says, the question is not whether there are prejudices, but what they are. Not whether the researcher or scientist can get rid of prejudices, but whether they have them right. One wants to say whether the aspect, the moment of prejudice has been consciously, critically coped with and placed. That is, we realize, like this whole like knowing what you don't know sort of notion, which has enormous implications for the world. When you think about that in terms of media environments and in the way that McLuhan talks about them, like the fact that we've all grown up in a world where more or less we all grew up with electricity, right? But human beings before us didn't do that. That must have made them a bit different. You know, they had at least a different experience. So whether, you know, you can read these things with that lens without necessarily knowing that you're doing that. And I think that's
Peter,
at the heart of why.
Peter, just one thing. There are some disturbances in the sound. So how about maybe you move maybe about 3 inches back to see if the sound improves. There are clicks. Let's try that. Go ahead.
Is this working?
Yeah, I think let's try it. Let's try it. I'll hear. There are some clicks. I think it is too high.
Okay,
maybe you can reduce the audio.
Okay, I might have to replug my audio interface, which is obnoxious. Just give me a second and I'll do that. Sure. All right, thank you.
Folks, just a minute. I just want to improve the sound quality. There's a little bit of clicks.
So I think I'm done. Is this back? Is it okay?
It's okay. Let's continue.
Okay.
I'm going to hear it for a while, and if there is an issue, I'll bring it up. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So at this point, I want to move into the in case of death. So in 1964, the Second Vatican Council was underway, and I believe Pope Paul VI, Saint Pope Paul VI, was Pope, and he had offered him a cardinalship that he had to refuse because he was sick and dying. And he knew that Pope Paul VI, Saint Pope Paul VI, was influenced by the work he was doing. So in case of death, he writes this. He says, if it were to be published once again, it would be good, let's say, in the form of an epilogue, to say from the intent from which this book originated. First of all, it was extremely personal. It concerned my friendship with Karl Neuendorfer and tried to clarify that in terms of thinking. But adjoined to this, the intent was also of a theoretical character. It is directed, 1, to find a comprehensive and structural principle that is applicable everywhere. 2, to give expression to the conviction that in the history of the West, women have not had the position that they deserve, that they instead, through the equation of spirit and so on, in every series of form, in every field, consciously or unconsciously, I think is very important, have been placed under the character of what is of second rank. So that is fascinating to me, because you can read that whole thing and sort of not get that, that unconsciously women have been considered second rank. And this sort of ties into the notion of intuition, perhaps. But here's the third point, the third and final thing in case of death. 3, finally, mediating the insistent distinction between opposition and contradiction that we've just discussed, the Widerspruch, it should be discovered that Gnosticism, both overt and hidden, is operating everywhere in Western history. How, in a way which is almost obvious, it has become completely common to equate opposition, what we've just talked about, these tensions, and contradiction, good and bad, yes and no. And he says this is clear when one thinks of names like Goethe, Thomas Mann, Andre Gide, Carl Jung, and so on.
Peter, let's do one thing. Let's try one thing. On the Zoom audio, if you could reduce the volume of your mic.
Okay. How is that?
That's good. Go ahead. Let's try that.
Okay, great. I'm sorry about this. In fact, I got a new audio interface to make sure this didn't happen, and I'm not sure why it is happening. So Focusrite, don't love them. Anyway, so is it easy to understand what I'm saying, Shrikant? Or is
no, I think the clicks, actually it was better with the higher volume. There are these clicks that are there. I can understand you fully. Everybody is able to understand you fully, but there are these minor clicks. I just want to keep the quality of the sound high, so when people are listening to it on YouTube.
Yes, I agree. I'm going to try one more time to unplug and replug. Just give me 1 sec.
Folks, just let me know if you're hearing clicks. I just want to make sure that it's not just my problem. Are you guys hearing clicks, or is it okay? Okay. Okay, let's try.
How about that? Are we riding? Are we good?
I think we're good. Let's
okay,
go.
Good. Cool. So so he has another note in that same year, 1964. He dies in 1968, where he goes into detail about what he means by the difference between opposition and contradiction. So he says, to review, the opposition is a phenomenon which is extended all throughout reality with a particular significance in the sphere of that which is living, which then takes on decisive importance in the sphere of what is personal. And he talks about how this is a unity born in tension, that they exist on an axis. And then he says, the concept of opposition acquires a purely and simply decisive significance from its distinction from that of contradiction. Yes and no, good and evil, being and non-being are not oppositions, but contradictory. They exclude each other. He who gives assent to one denies the other. The opposed also exclude from one another, but only relatively, with reference to a moment of their relation, the axis, the center. In the same way, it's absolutely wrong to mention poles in the face of contradictory elements. In the face of opposed determinations, one affirms, the other excludes. Exclusion, nevertheless, takes place in such a way as to become possible only by reference to that former determination, therefore to presuppose and co-signify it, but as its opposite. On the other hand, contradiction excludes in a pure and simple sense, and precisely in such a way that the positive part is determined by itself, not by the other thing. That is, the yes is determined by the yes, the good is determined by the good, and the being is determined by the being, while the no is not actually determined by the no, but is only determined by the yes, the evil only determined by the good, non-being only determined by the being. That's where these privations receive their definition, from the thing that they have reduced from. And
this is brilliant, because what it does is that it is actually making this point about this dance between yin and yang. So he's made the point about that, and then he's distinguishing it clearly from the law of non-contradiction, which is a big part of the Western tradition. So he's placing the observations he's making in the context of Western epistemology by saying contradiction does this, the oppositions do that, and these are how they are different. It's excellent.
And continuing on just briefly, he says, this distinction comes to be absolutely fundamental for the scope of that which has a spiritual personal life. So he's talking about human beings, the only things that we know have a spiritual life. He says, it is equivalent to an essential destruction in the absolute sense when opposition and contradiction are conflated, when they come to mean the same thing. He says, this is the destruction of absolute values, of the personal acts which define a person, the impossibility of the person themselves. Immediately then, the no, the evil, and the nothing become moments pregnant with content. And he says, reciting earlier, the phenomenon extends throughout all the history of the Western world, Gnosis, alchemy, Romanticism, Goethe, Carl Jung, most recent literature. He says, the no is considered as belonging to the yes, the nothing as belonging to existence, the evil as a part of the good, and in a final analysis, and expressly, the satanic element as being a part of God. Which he writes, according to Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew 12:32, is the absolute sin, the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. That is to say, the quote, sense of God. And that notion that there's a tension between good and evil, as opposed to being contradictory to each other, privation. This is precisely where the dialogue between Carl Jung and Victor White, the Dominican priest, this is where it could go no further, because this aspect was not realized by either of them in that discussion. So yeah, that's the sort of final point there.
Excellent. So I want to connect it to one other point, and that's the cogitative sense of Aquinas. We looked at that, and the core idea there is that you have these external senses, and then you have this imagination which is producing things from those external senses. And then you have this cogitative sense which takes that in to identify patterns in that, and then drives your evaluative faculty, which drives action. So there is this loop that is going on. So you can look at it as, you can look at things at the perceptual level, the outside level, and then you can look at things at the inner level. And there is this loop going on continuously between them. And it is an opposition. And this is very different from, let's say, the Platonic view, where there is this, they're saying, okay, there are these ideas that exist. So looks like Guardini is completely in the tradition of Aquinas in terms of the cogitative faculty. Is that correct?
It's funny because it is, but that is not obvious on the face of it. Because at the time when he was writing, the universities were dominated by Aquinas. But it was this version of Aquinas that eliminated this reality to the work that he did and sort of replaced it with this sort of impotent language that, if you actually read the literature, they don't even speak about the cogitative power. It's as if the soul of Aquinas was taken away in this neo-scholastic view. So Guardini actually studies Bonaventure, who was Aquinas's contemporary. But I've been translating a lot of Guardini. And just because most of it is not available in English. And I decided to translate some of his letters, and I was surprised to find this. He's writing to his friend in 1914, right when this is written, the original first draft of the Oppositions. He says, Dear Joseph, dear friend, Joseph Beeger, he says, many new things have occurred to me over the last few days. A great pleasure, especially. I have come to realize that the theologian to whom I am most close inwardly is St. Thomas. Are you surprised? He says, see, I realize that I can only go together permanently with such a thinker who, as it were, has a, quote, open system, who thinks antithetically. One such is Thomas. He's turned towards the real and its mystery, and it allows me to constantly go beyond it with my own thoughts. So here I find, and that makes me happy, that my innermost being is connected to the main point of his tradition. So that is kind of shocking, because he's typically not drawn in to the Thomas tradition at all. Pope Benedict XVI studied Bonaventure too. All of these popes have great respect for St. Thomas, but not many of them would consider themselves to be most like him inwardly. And so I just find that fascinating that Guardini writes this. Oddly enough, Pope Francis has given great, before he was Pope, one of his sort of mentor priests in Argentina was this very strange sort of disbarred Thomist named Rafael Tello. And he wrote an introduction to a book about him right before he became Pope, quite unexpectedly. So I think you're quite right to assign the significance of that particularity of the cogitative power is something that is, in a sense, the soul of Aquinas's at least material component of how that inward is related to the outward. And I want to read one final quote from Guardini because it relates precisely to that point. He says, here lies precisely the critical importance of the idea of the opposition. As a principle of living formation, as a norm of living recognition, it is a means for the individual to achieve the measure of organic universality assigned to it. That is to say, to achieve individual relation to the human world as a whole. Whoever looks out of it and acts, his attitude to the world is deeply transformed. He grows out of naive inclusion in his environment. The side of the object which is related to it bulges into the roundness of the whole thing, even if the other side remains more in the dark. The things related to him by choice come into relation with the rest, even if they remain distant from him. The individual environment is recognized in its conditionality and limitation, and is classified in its essential relationship to the human world. So just like the cogitative power deals with my father or this tree or this apartment that I'm in, that is the sense that there are other people with other fathers, with other streets, other apartments. It doesn't change the universal of father or apartment, or even the 10 commandments that say, honor thy mother and father. Perhaps most decisively, it comes down to love thy neighbor. Who are you close to? Who are you encountering? It's strictly set within human limits. We know what we know. We're responsible for what we can understand. And there are things that are beyond our purview that other people must be responsible for. That is to say, if we remain closed in on ourselves and think that we can do everything, we will find ourselves quite impotent. But if we are able to recognize that slice of universality that has been assigned to us, we can actually control quite a bit within that scope. And keeping that, I think the open system word is very key. The ability to listen, to hear other people, and potentially to shake up. I was like, oh, I couldn't have known that. How, like, that's not in my experience. It's so great that I'm able to listen to someone and they can tell me something I didn't know. This seems quite obvious, but when I think looking at social media and particularly I think American politics, where it has this sort of contradiction style to it, where there are good guys and bad guys, there are winners and losers, there are if you're not with us, you're against us. This whole notion, this is not the realm of human beings. This is human beings trying to delve into outside their scope, into the realm of God, really. Who, even if you're not Christian, we're talking about being, right? No human being can prescind from humanity and just become being as such. That's not possible. And that's, I think, at the heart of what Guardini is saying here. So
fantastic. Peter, this is great. So what I want to do now, firstly, I think that you've been extremely clear. I mean, it's just amazing how much we've been able to do within an hour. Okay. But what I want to do now is that it is a very complex topic. And I want to make sure, I want to see where other people are, and I want to give them a chance to ask questions. So the way we're going to do, the way we're going to do it is that we're going to do it in a lightning round style. Okay. So folks, go ahead and ask the questions. I'm going to compile all the questions. I'm going to organize all the questions, and then we'll have Peter answer all the questions. Normally we'll take a break to do the breakout rooms, but what I want to do is that I want to make sure that, you know, that you've gotten what is being said and you can ask the questions about it. So go ahead and type exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom if you would like to put a question on the table. The first one up is David. David, go ahead. What we're going to do is that we're not going to answer the questions right now. We're going to collect all the questions, organize them, and then we will answer all of them. David.
Right. So yeah, and I was here at the beginning, but a lot has happened. A lot of water's gone to the bridge. So I want to keep this in a perspective. So what was the overall sort of intent of what the work is focused on? Is it focused on comprehending life, or giving an expression to what life is, just an expression, or to organize a way for us to communicate and think about so that we can have a paradigm we're sharing? Or is it to establish a morality by talking about what's universal? What was the focal point?
Beautiful, beautiful question. Excellent question. All right, next up is going to be Mark. We'll collect all the questions and then we'll go ahead and answer them. Mark, go ahead.
Thank you, Shrikant, and what a beautiful presentation, Peter. Thank you very much. My question is actually an echo of what we just heard, and it is the centrality of contradiction in Marxism and the obvious answering going on here. And so my question is, where are we today in this contrast between really the only two sort of comprehensive world systems in our lifetimes, Marxism and the Roman Catholic Church? They're the only two that matter. Everything else has fallen apart. Where are we today in that contrast?
Excellent. Next up is going to be Sean Murray. Go ahead, Sean Murray, it's your turn. Sean Murray, let me see what's going on. I can't hear you. Can you go ahead and type your question? Okay, so folks, go ahead and type exclamation mark to put your questions down. Anybody else? Okay, so we're going to start off with David's question, and keep typing exclamation marks for your questions, or raise your hand in Zoom. So David's question, I mean, that was a brilliant question. You know, what is the overall intent of Guardini? What is he trying to do? take your time to answer it. Go ahead, Peter.
Sure. I think at the heart of it, he was trying, as a Catholic priest, his conversion came from this conversation that he had with Karl Neuendorfer, who this whole thing is dedicated to. And when he became a priest, he came through all these roadblocks, right? Where I think what he really wanted to do is make it relevant by hitting at reality. That is, if God is real, then surely all these things can't be discounted that that aren't being said in the schools. And I think ultimately it's very much, I think, of an underdog voice that he's giving. I think he had seen, I mean, he writes in his In Case of Death that consciously or unconsciously women had been given second rank. People seemingly had no structural principle to speak about, so he had to invent one. And then the third aspect, that Gnosticism was sort of running everywhere, that people were sort of speaking as if they were the voice of God. And I believe that's what Guardini was sort of trying to temper. And in a way, to sort of recognize the challenges of his time, because he writes a lot more later about technology and how it's changing human beings' relationship to each other, the relationship to the universe, the relationship to themselves. And I think he was trying to create a new anthropology, a new framework for understanding human beings in a world where the scale of human beings could be eliminated in machine work, in machine planning, in social systems, in all these new psychologies that were coming around. And I hope that that's a good answer to your question. But I think what he was really trying to do, in a word, is sort of fight for the underdog, which in this case is humanity.
Thank you.
Simply put.
Let's get 2 more questions on the table. First one is by Joe. Joe, go ahead. What's your question?
Hi, Peter, and thank you for your presentation. It was incredible.
Thank you, Joe.
What was his overall impact on the Second Vatican Council, or his most important impact on the Second Vatican Council?
Okay, excellent.
Excellent.
So we'll take Shane Murray's question next, then we'll go to Joe and then Mark. So can you, Peter, can you read the question yourself and answer it?
Yeah, of course. So Shane Marie asks, can you clarify further how to recognize the universality that is assigned to us uniquely? You mentioned listening, but not all things resonate on an individual level, nor are they always digestible. So what Guardini is saying with these oppositions is that if you know they exist and you find yourself, let's say in this one of production and disposition, let's say you're spending all your time innovating, doing novelty. If you understand that that tension exists, you might say, well, disposition also exists, and it might not be what I'm good at or what I enjoy doing, but when I see it, I shouldn't consider it as an enemy. I should rather consider it as something that is not within my purview. It's not what I'm best at. It's not what I'm most well trained to use. But if I understand that when I'm doing creative, productive work, that I'm standing tied, in a sense, to a counterweight somewhere in which disposition is in some way involved, whether I like it or not, in what I'm doing, you suddenly are open to that thought. Likewise, I mean, the funniest way I like to think of it is, and I think Guardini even writes something like this, that imagine a person who only ever breathed in. They would suffocate. If they only ever breathed out, they would also suffocate. They would stop living very, very quickly. And if they tried to compromise between breathing in and breathing out, they'd find they're not breathing at all also. So, like, knowing when you're near that pole point, it's a mode of orientation, I think, or at least that was his intention in trying to outline these things. Because some people might just say creativity is good. If you're not creative, you're not good, or some people might say order is good. If it's not in order, it's not good. Guardini is trying to make a case for the existence of both of these things as existing. And so I hope that makes sense, Shane Marie.
Okay, thank you.
Cool.
Next up, we'll take Joe's question. Joe asks about the Second Vatican Council. And
right. What was Guardini's impact overall on the Second Vatican Council? It is a very deep question. Guardini retired from teaching in 1961. He was too sick to do it. In fact, he was even sick before that. In 1959, Guardini delivered a lecture to what amounts to really, I think, the first computer science students in Munich, called The Machines and Humanity. And he wasn't actually able to go to Munich at that time in 1959. He was too sick to do it, even though he considered this a matter of capital importance, to talk to those leaders of that technical initiative and make sure that they understand what's at stake in their work. And so, no doubt, when the Second Vatican Council was happening, he read the newspaper, he knew what was happening, and he couldn't participate. He's been called a precursor of Vatican II by some biographers. Robert Krieg, I think, wrote a book with that title. But by all means, by the time the council was happening, he was not there, and he couldn't be. Pope Paul VI, Saint Paul VI, publicly claimed him as an influence in the way that he intends to be pope as he presides over this council. But I think if there is a way that his influence was felt in the council, despite his inability to participate in it personally, and despite what he might have thought, I think the way it's expressed in history is the notion of relevance and non-enemy. So Pope Francis has this phrase, polyhedral globalization. So the Second Vatican Council is, we're all one world now. There's nuclear bombs. There's televisions. Peace be with you. And also with you. Let's shake hands. And so Guardini brings up the question, how do we maintain our individuality in the scope of global existence? And so that's what Francis calls polyhedral globalization, as opposed to unilateral globalization. Everyone has the same culture. No. McLuhan called it multicultural mosaic. I think it would be easy to say, because the liturgy was changed into the anecdote, right? Sorry, not into the anecdote. I just read the Zoom thing there. Into the vernacular, right? Maybe that's Guardini's main influence. But I think he may have been surprised at that development. That is not to say he would have disagreed with it, but he didn't really live to see the church in those conditions. So I think I would say his main overall impact was the drive to make the faith living and real. And in fact, those were Pope Benedict's last words when he abdicated, which is really the first time that's ever happened. He quoted Guardini in saying, the church is not an institution devised and built at table. It is a living reality. She changes her style according to the times and place, like any other living being, but her nature remains the same. At her heart is Christ. So I guess that's how I would answer your question. So
wonderful.
Thank you, Joe.
So we'll take one more question and then we'll do breakout rooms for about 15-20 minutes. Great. So we get to kind of interact a lot more. So the last question is from Mark, and then folks will have a chance to come back after the breakout rooms to ask more questions. What I want to do is I want to make sure that things are clear, so you can discuss things, and then you can come back and ask more questions. So Mark was asking, how does Guardini's thought relate to Marx and his thought about contradictions? Go ahead.
I read sort of two questions in Marx's question. That was the first part, but then he said, where are we today in the contrast between Marx and the Roman Catholic Church? So obviously there is a in Marx, which I haven't read much Marx myself, but from what I understand, there is this notion of a divide between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, in which the bourgeoisie exploit the proletariat, etc., and sort of one is seen as good and the other evil, perhaps. I don't know much about Marx, but what I do know is that, or rather what I feel comfortable answering, is where we are today in contrast between Marx and the Roman Catholic Church. That contrast is that, I suppose, Marxism today has sort of a relationship in not only China, but also within the Catholic Church itself. So there's this notion of something called liberation theology, but also, which is to say that salvation comes from liberation of the poor. But there's also this notion of the preferential option for the poor. So the Catholic Church sees the poor as having real faith. It's not that they need to be educated in all the right dogma to have faith. And you can find everywhere in Scripture Christ saying, the rich man, the eye of the needle, etc. Give alms to the poor, corporal, spiritual acts of mercy. The Catholic Church is all about charity, right? That is the chief theological virtue. Love thy neighbor as yourself, right? So the tension there, I think, is how does the Catholic Church help, I believe, the poor, and I think the relationship between the rich and the poor. How do we turn that from something that can be observed as contradiction and turn it into something that is a living sort of exchange, where there's a mutual reciprocal respect and sort of lively charity between these two groups? It's not easy to think about, but it is the task that we have, I think, because that disparity has grown so far. It is almost impossible to ignore. And which is to say nothing about the relation that Marx has in China, which is completely separate, right? So that is, I think, how I would answer that question. I think Guardini is extremely important, and I think central to that question. And it's no mystery that Francis, the man who has been selected as Pope, I think is uniquely prepared to deal with that question. So yeah, I think some friends just came over. So, but I'm still doing this. Okay. Yes, here we go.
Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. All right. So this is your chance to either talk about your takeaways or ask any final questions that you have. If you would like to share your takeaways, or if you would like to ask a question, go ahead and type an exclamation mark in chat, or you can raise your hand in Zoom. Mark.
Oh, Mark, you are muted.
I happen to know that what you have heard here tonight has literally never been heard before. Guardini has not been studied, as Wayne detailed before. Karl Rahner and a lot of other people have gotten a lot more attention. Guardini faded completely from attention. And the work that Peter has done, he does not read German, and it's all in German. So he's like bringing all the resources of the world, robots and human beings, to help him translate the German. Absolutely amazing. Francis is a remarkable character. He's 83 years old. He's hated by everybody. The left wing, the right wing, they all hate Francis. And yet, my suspicion is that in particular with what happens after Francis, Francis will become even more important. So my question for you is, how would you evaluate Francis in the larger scheme of technocratic paradigms?
Yeah, it's a great question. Francis, in his encyclical Laudato Si, the third chapter is called The Human Roots of the Ecological Crisis. And in it, he almost brings us back to where we started here today. That is, this is a human. This is its sort of, this is the way it works. And this is a machine. But what Francis is saying is that ultimately, the products that come from human beings, of which machines are some, are products for which we are responsible. And the relationship that human beings have to being, per se, and nature, as far as that is, natural creation by God, the being that we take from it, if we can't vouch for it, it doesn't just return to being. Like we have to shape it. And there, as far as I know, no pope before Francis has said the words technocratic paradigm. And he says, the way that he begins that chapter, which is littered with footnotes from Guardini's The End of the Modern World, is he says, should we not pause and consider the role of human being and human action in the world? And he talks about how it's not just environmental pollution, of which that is obviously a huge part, but the amount of control that human beings seemingly have over each other. That the decisions that may seem purely instrumental may in fact be decisions about the sort of society that we would like to build. Because again, these products come from human drives. Just as Guardini writes in this Gegensatz, of which Francis was, again, going to write his dissertation on, he says, when talking about science, he says, does the worldview and this worldview go to the core of apparently exact scientific judgments not ultimately mean a function of a type with all its social individual components? That is something that might appear as this objective thing that fell from heaven is just the way that this guy likes to do something, or the way that these people formed in this particular circumstance think it ought to be, and will impose on other people. I think Francis is calling for air and consideration. And I think that attention, I think he is precisely attuned to the question of our time. And that question is not going away. So I agree. After Francis will continue to remain this touchstone for that question, which will only get more severe.
Wonderful.
I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Jean.
Yes, I joined the meeting late, so I think it's quite fascinating. What I'm wondering is, like, we are so impacted by the media. We actually went a 2 weeks RV trip in Alaska, and my kids, all they want is internet and play game with his friend online. And it was like, we are so impacted by that. It's very hard. And I think the problem is like we said human create the machine, but it's different human. Human is such abstract concept. It's
Exactly.
a small amount of human create something that control majority of human, that they have
Right.
no power understanding to escape it. I think that's the scary part. And I think it's important for us to learn from history and helping each other to understand it and find a way get out of it, especially our kids. I think they are so unequipped, because I learned how Bill Gates bind his kids to use the internet. That why do they create it if they bind it from their own kids and poison other kids? And I think it's important for have this. They have so many power. The internet company donate amount of money into societies to study how that impact kids and adults as well psychologically, and create certain kind of like guidance or something. They need to invest money to research on this. I don't think depend on each individual, we have the power to fully understand and control. It's hard. I can understand why my kids cannot control. Even for me, sometimes it's like one news, like rabbit hole, I get into it. I was like, I want to know why, what happened. I was like, and I waste my whole night, find out things maybe it's not even important to me. It's just like, it's such easy, it's like black hole everywhere, black hole on internet. It's like you jump into it and you're in it. It's so dangerous. So
Yeah,
I just wonder.
That's fantastic, and it makes me want to continue what I had said about Mark's question, which is about what Francis is talking about here. Is one reason why he will be important even after he passes is that he founded two new bodies in the Vatican, two dicasteries they're called. One is the Dicastery of Communication, which is basically the media wing of the Catholic Church. It's brand new. Francis made it. And the other one, which is what you're sort of concerned with, like the development of children, who is studying this stuff, who has money and resources to figure out, to anticipate the effects of these products on new people who have no idea that they're coming into a world where it is their environment. The other dicastery is called the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development. And the head of that dicastery is a Cardinal Peter Turkson of Ghana. And at this point, I want to just quote again from Laudato Si, because he says, "It can be said that many problems of today's world stem from the tendency, at times unconscious, to make the method and aims of science and technology an epistemological paradigm which shapes the lives of individuals and the workings of society. The effects of imposing this model on reality as a whole, human and social, are seen in the deterioration of the environment, but that's just one sign of the reductionism which affects every aspect of human and social life. We have to accept that technological products are not neutral, for they create a framework which ends up conditioning lifestyles and shaping social possibilities along the lines dictated by the interests of certain powerful groups." And then he quotes Guardini. He says, "Technology tends to absorb everything into its ironclad logic. And those who are surrounded with technology," quoting Guardini here, "know full well that it moves forward in the final analysis, neither for profit nor for the well-being of the human race, and that, quote, in the most radical sense of the term, power is its motive, a lordship over all." So this brings us back to the notion of having that slice of universality, right? So a human being gets a slice. They don't get universality. They don't get human being per se. They don't get the world per se. And so any decision to affect the world per se can only fail, and fail hilariously and sometimes even tragically. But again, that doesn't mean that action is not possible. It means that we have to understand the limits of our action and the limits of our intervention, and then do them, and do them well. But to be able to vouch for it, to be responsible for it, to not take on too much responsibility, or a lordship over all is not possible, but a lordship over something might be. So that's the way that I would answer that question.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Mike, Joe, and David. Mike.
Mike. I think Mike has to unmute, maybe.
Mike, is your mic working? Okay, next up is Joe, followed by David. Joe.
I mean, in a way, actually, Peter just really kind of addressed what my question was, is that, like, how did Guardini essentially impact Laudato Si, and in what specific ways? And because we talked a little bit about the idea of how important nature is, and just his influence over Pope Francis in writing that encyclical specifically, and then also his views on even the economic aspect of Laudato Si. You know, did Guardini have any impact on that, or his writings have any impact on that?
All of the citations of Guardini in Laudato Si come from the book The End of the Modern World. And what that book does is describe sort of three eras of human existence, human cosmology, ultimately limited, I think, to the Western world he's talking about. So he talks about classical and medieval sensibility and the sort of cosmology that accompanies it, which is, even in the classical, you have the human at the center, and then you have the fixed stars, the planets, etc., that affect the human being, and you have measurements of all of them. But then in the medieval worldview, you have the same thing, but what's new is that suddenly there's this transcendent element, not only in the cosmos and what was called by the medievals the Empyrean heaven, but internally in the heart, in the soul of a human being, and their ability to touch the divine through prayer. Then you have the modern world. And so that modern world roughly coincides with the development of print technology and the new cosmology that develops from that transcendent element, of which prayer and the transcendent Empyrean heaven have their role. But this gives you the Kepler and the Galileo and that whole world of multiple galaxies, multiple star systems, the sun as the center of a solar system, right? And thus it changes man's sense of responsibility to the world and created the situation in which man felt perfectly justified colonizing the planet and if they could, colonizing other planets too. But Guardini's thesis in that book, The End of the Modern World, is that world is gone. We are no longer in the modern world. We are in something else, and it doesn't have a name yet. And he didn't call it postmodern either. But he describes the characteristics of that new world as there were three elements that constituted that modern sensibility. And they are nature subsisting in itself, humans as being autonomous, and then culture growing naturally out of the humans, basically. So that's the sort of license to do whatever you want, right? Because it's natural, it's nature. But then Guardini writes, in this new circumstance, you have a nature that is not natural. You have humans who are in some way non-human, and you have a culture which has transformed into a threat, whereas previously culture was the defense from the dangers of nature. And now he says the danger arises from culture itself. So to answer your question, how does that impact Laudato Si? And I think it comes back to Genesis, which is, as Guardini puts it, in Power and Responsibility. Adam's job in the Garden of Eden before the fall, and Eve's, was to not only name things, but to be stewards of creation, ultimately to vouch for it, to be responsible for it. When they tried to know good and evil, in a sense, they assumed that lordship over all and lost the ability to be responsible for anything. And they had to regain it through labor, right? So this, I think, this notion in Genesis and Guardini's read of it in End of the Modern World and Power and Responsibility gives rise to Francis's notion of human beings as custodians and stewards of nature and what we do with nature, which includes power plants and things like that. So his influence is really vast. I recommend reading it. The third chapter of Laudato Si is where all of Guardini's citations come through. Highly recommend it.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Mike, followed by David. Mike.
Hi. Continuing along the line of Mark Stallman's comment about the merger of communism and Christianity, Ratzinger has been called the National Socialist Pope. Francis has been called the Che Guevara Pope. Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History. And Guardini, who I guess is the philosophical conscience of Francis, Pope Francis, not Francis Fukuyama, his work was called The End of the Modern World. And I just wonder if the tendency that we're about to get into a apocalyptic paradigm shift in how we're going to treat all of these things, how religion and the church is about to be transformed, and that maybe there won't be a pope after Francis.
Okay, so yeah, absolutely. So I'll start by saying that what unites the men Ratzinger and Bergoglio, Benedict and Francis, is Guardini. It is the factor that unites them. And Ratzinger, whatever else was going on in Germany when he was a young boy, the most important thing to him was the youth group that Guardini led, which is called the Quickborn. They had an almost mythic figure to them because Guardini taught in this castle Rothenfels. So it just sits on this little hill in this tiny edge of German prairie. And Benedict writes in an interview, he says the feeling that he had coming to the gate of Rothenfels Castle and seeing Guardini walk up to him, he was a fanboy. That's what it was. And so Guardini in the 1930s was very active in subverting the Gnostic stuff coming out of the Nazis, the Nazi Party, and in many cases quite explicitly too. I have here a short book called Der Heilbringer. There's another one called Der Heiland. When his biography of Christ, the Lord, was originally published in 1937, it was given the German title Der Herr. Guardini was aware that Germany at that time had a misplaced sense of religion, that their religious impulse, connatural to humanity, was being pushed towards political, worldly goals, as if they could be reduced to the historical task of a people. And Guardini said, no, do that if you wish, but that's not Christ and that's not the church. And if you do that, you are quite simply not in communion with the church. You may be taking communion, but that's not the church. It's something else and something very dangerous. And so Bergoglio in the 1980s, right after the Dirty War, he writes something called The Need for a Political Anthropology, a pastoral problem. He writes about the political is thus confused by a fracture of visions. And likewise, dealing with, you might say, Hitler in the 30s, you have Bergoglio in the 80s describing, for example, he talks about profane messianisms. He says, the technical mentality, together with the search for profane messianism, are two expressive features of the man of today whom we can well qualify as Gnostic man, possessor of knowledge but lacking unity. On the other hand, in need of the esoteric, in this case, secularized, that is, the profane. In this sense, it can be said that the temptation of politics is to be Gnostic and esoteric, not being able to handle the power of technique from the inner unity that springs from the real ends and the means used on a human scale. The crisis cannot be overcome by any kind of quote-unquote return, of which the dying modernity has persistently tried, but rather is overcome by quote-unquote internal overflow that is at the very core of the crisis, assuming it in its totality without remaining in it, but transcending it inwards. That's very strange. But what he's ultimately saying there, he talks about the bipolar tension of fullness and limit, that second one that we talked about earlier, which is shape and what eludes being shaped. So I think ultimately what we're talking about here is the profane messianism that we assign to the hopes of technology to lift us out of our condition. There are a lot of examples of that today. But as far as apocalypse goes, to end the question here, is the key to understanding what apocalypse means for the church today is to hit at the etymology and recognize that apocalypse is an unveiling or a revelation of God's will. And it doesn't mean the end of anything, but rather the beginning of understanding. So what is certain is that we face new problems. And Guardini wrote in 1940, right after the war, or 1946, right after the war, he said, there is a new factor in history that has not yet been dealt with. It is the unity of inhumanity and the machine. That is the new factor. That is the threat that threatens. This did not happen before. We can talk about atrocities. We can talk about the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. We can even talk about the Armenian genocide. But when we talk about bacterial warfare, when we talk about nuclear bombs, these are just expressions of this basic fact that we have built scientific apparatuses that can be controlled by children that are capable of programmatically wiping out specific people. That is the danger. This is a new question. And no profane messianism and hope that we'll just fix ourselves out of the problem is going to do it. We are, as to quote McLuhan, our only hope is apocalypse, which does not mean the end of the world, but rather recognition of the task and the question at hand.
Thank you, Peter. Last question is from David. David, go ahead.
Well, in light of the problematic areas you're highlighting, I hear technology, it's a real focus. It's one of the oppositions that we're definitely confronting is technology. Right. Where's the term capitalism, the discussion of the inhumanity of technology, when it is a co-equal anti-human force, and when it's not under some higher power, right? Some greater power. And if capitalism is just another, you want to call it a technology, why are we putting its name in the shadows? Or are we going to say, well, we've already covered it, falls under avarice and sin and in some pathological conceptual categorization of things? It seems I'm not really asking as much a religious point of view as a real politic point of view, but we seem to be engaged in both.
Well, I have a beautiful quote for you from Pope Francis, who called unfettered capitalism, quote, the dung of the devil. So
yeah, there you go.
I hope that answers your question.
Good, we use the word, thanks. It's right there. And, but the technology seems more stressed than the capitalism, but I think capitalism drives the technology. Yeah,
so there's something more than just the dung of the devil here. So the Guardini, as a theologian, thinks that it's this Gnostic urge that drives the technology. Again, in that quote in Laudato Si, the lordship overall, like not even profit. That is to say, there are people who will build something just to have power over someone, and they might not get money for it at all. But if they can exercise influence, that's enough for them. But I think this is where I think McLuhan is very interesting, because he talks about with the invention of the printing press, you suddenly have invented the economic form of industrial production, uniform item on the shelf, of which there are maybe 500, 5,000 copies of the same item. The first interchangeable part was the letterpress. And you could ultimately say, yes, the alienation of the worker from their labor is a real dehumanizing deprivation. It is something of a reduction of being. And so the way that Francis has dealt with this, and the way that someone like Guardini would talk about these economic issues, is in terms of what is called Catholic social teaching. So over the pandemic, Pope Francis actually gave a series of lectures on this topic. Catholic social teaching has three components. One is called human dignity. So that's, first off, well, you can't do that to humans because they have their own realm of being. That is their responsibility, right? So, and the second is called subsidiarity, which means that the smallest body of organization should make the decision on something. And I'm reducing these quite a bit. The third is called solidarity, which has obvious application to the plight of workers, right? So I would highly recommend reading these general audiences. They're available on the Vatican website. They were given, I think there are 8 of them. He goes through 8 different aspects of, it's all under the header of healing the world. There are about 10 of them. They're in September every week. And so if you search Pope Francis, general audience, healing the world on Google, you'll find each of these addresses where economics are sort of, the economics of charity, perhaps you might say, or the politics of charity are sort of explicitly stated. And so, yeah, I think it's fair to say that Guardini, the scope in which he talks about capitalism is necessarily in a theological sense and in a social psychological sense, mostly because I don't think he had much of a, in fact, he decided not to become an economist. So I don't think he liked approaching it through that way. But yeah, you'll find it in his critique of the modern world as the sort of launching of an essentially what he would call a Gnostic sort of seizing of the powers of nature as if they were formless, as if they had no essence of their own. And then when that encroached enough on humanity, and then the powers over nature got so strong that there could be a mastery over humanity, which we see in the social sciences as they developed in the 20th century, alarm bells were really, really ringing, I think. And I hope that answers your question adequately.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you, Peter. Peter, that was fantastic. I think, I knew that this is going to be a good meetup, but it has turned out to be a spectacular one. I think we've covered a lot of
I was very nervous.
Yeah, no, we've covered a lot of ground. It is a very difficult topic. It is kind of integration of religion and, secular thought and modern technology and how things have changed. And I think you did a spectacular job of bringing everything together. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you soon. Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.